You're strapped down, the air thick with salt, sweat, and the iron scent of blood. Around you stand towering men with braids, axes at their belts, and eyes that don't just look at you. They measure how long you'll last. This isn't a battle, this is punishment. And in Viking culture, punishment wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about spectacle, humiliation, and pain so unimaginable that begging for death became the only relief. The Vikings are remembered as raiders, explorers, and warriors who carved their way across Europe. But what rarely gets told, at least in full, is how they dealt with enemies, traitors, or even their own people when punishment was required. Their methods weren't quick executions. They were carefully engineered acts of torment, rooted in law, superstition, and raw intimidation. Some tortures were designed to test honor, others were warnings. A few were so gruesome that historians debate whether they were even real, because they read more like nightmares than history. But we do have sources. Chronicles, sagas, and medieval accounts describe rituals of pain that pushed the limits of human endurance. And once we step inside that world, it's not just about Vikings being brutal. It's about how a society used agony as theater, as law, and as a grim form of storytelling. So let's walk into the darkest corners of Viking justice, where mercy didn't exist, where torture was slow, deliberate, and unforgettable. And let's start with the most infamous method of all. It begins with a rib cage, your rib cage. The blood eagle, the very name drips with horror. Medieval chroniclers describe it as a ritual execution reserved for oath breakers and traitors. The victim's ribs were cut from the spine, peeled open like the wings of a bird, and the lungs pulled outward to flap grotesquely in the open air. To be killed this way wasn't just death, it was a final declaration that you had broken faith so badly that your body itself became a warning. Now historians argue about whether the blood eagle was ever truly performed, or if it was a literary invention in sagas. But here's what makes it chilling: the detail. Multiple sources, written centuries apart, describe the same sequence: knives carving ribs, lungs displayed like wings. Too vivid to dismiss, too cruel to ignore. If even one Viking warlord used it as a way to terrify his enemies, the legend alone would have done the rest. But the blood eagle wasn't unique in using anatomy against its owner. The Vikings believed punishment had to be more than death. It had to mean something, and pain became a language. Take drowning, a simple way to kill, right? Not in Viking law. Women accused of adultery or witchcraft could be tied in sacks with snakes or stones and cast into icy waters. This wasn't just about ending a life. It was about denying dignity, cutting off breath in a way that looked like divine judgment. Some sagas mention trial by water, where survival was considered proof of innocence. But the tests were rigged. Float, and you were guilty of consorting with evil. Sink, and you drowned, innocent. Either way, the water became executioner. Still, water was merciful compared to what happened to captured enemies. Picture this: you're a prisoner after a raid, bound and dragged back to a Viking settlement. Death comes slowly. Sometimes it wasn't even a single act of torture, but days of deliberate suffering. Captives might be tied to posts and flayed, strips of skin peeled from the flesh while the community watched. Others were placed inside crude cages, where ravens sacred to Odin would be left to peck them apart alive. The Norse didn't view this as cruelty for cruelty's sake. In their worldview, torture is linked to the gods. Odin himself was a god of wisdom who embraced pain, hanging for 9 nights on Yggdrasil, pierced by his spear, to gain knowledge of runes. To suffer was in a warped way to mirror divine sacrifice, and for enemies that meant agony wasn't just punishment, it was a ritual. But if you thought the Vikings reserved horror only for outsiders, think again. Justice inside their own communities could be just as brutal. Outlawry was a common punishment, being declared outside the law, stripped of protection, free for anyone to kill. And often torture followed before exile. Hands were crushed with hammers, tendons were sliced to cripple. In some cases, tongues were cut out, ensuring you couldn't defend yourself verbally ever again. To be outlawed wasn't just losing your life, it was losing your voice, your body, and your place in the world. Yet not every Viking torture was about mutilation. Some were about psychological torment, humiliation so deep it outlived the victim. Imagine being tied down and smeared with honey. It sounds harmless until you're left in a swamp, your body covered in sticky sweetness. Insects swarm, ants, flies, wasps stinging, biting, nesting in your wounds. It could take days before the victim finally succumbed, their body literally eaten alive. This method was so effective it's recorded in multiple cultures, but among Vikings, it carried an added layer. To be consumed by vermin was to be dishonored in death, denied a clean passage to Valhalla. For a warrior culture obsessed with glory, that fate was worse than death itself. And then there's burning. Fire was sacred in Norse belief, a bridge between worlds, but it was also one of the most terrifying tortures. Enemies might be bound in huts that were then set ablaze, forced to inhale smoke before fire consumed them. Others were roasted alive over slow-burning coals, not fast immolation, but gradual cooking. For witnesses, it was more than horror. It was a public reminder that betrayal or defeat could end with your body turned into ash. But the most disturbing methods weren't always about fire, knives, or even blood. Sometimes they used hunger. Captives might be locked in wooden stocks where they couldn't move, left without food or water, or exposed to cold winds. Starvation wasn't just slow, it was degrading. The body wasted away in full view, turning a human being into a skeleton long before death came. In sagas, starving an enemy wasn't described as practical, it was described as breaking their spirit. And in Norse thought, losing one's spirit was the ultimate defeat. So far, we've seen the Viking toolkit of agony: carving, drowning, burning, and starvation. But there's one more category that blurs the line between punishment and theater: staged tortures. Sometimes, victims weren't just killed, they were displayed. Corpses mutilated, body parts nailed to doors, heads impaled on spikes at harbor entrances. The message was clear: this is what happens if you cross us. For Vikings, torture wasn't hidden in dungeons. It was public, deliberate, and unforgettable. And here's where it gets darker. Some of these rituals weren't just about fear, they were believed to shape destiny. The sagas describe a method where an enemy's entrails were pulled out and wound around a pole while they were still alive. As gruesome as it sounds, this act symbolized turning their life into a thread, a kind of mockery of the Norns, the fates who wove human destinies. By unraveling someone's insides, the executioners weren't just killing them, they were rewriting their fate as humiliation. But if you think this is as bad as Viking torture gets, hold on to that thought, because some accounts describe punishments so vile, so drawn out, that death itself was almost a blessing. But as terrifying as entrails around a pole might sound, it was far from the last word in Viking cruelty, because the Norse had a chilling way of turning the environment itself into a torture device. Imagine being dragged into the frozen wilderness, stripped down, and tied to a tree. At first, the cold is sharp but bearable. Minutes turn to hours, and your body begins to betray you. Numb fingers, shivering so violently it feels like your bones will snap. And then silence. The cold doesn't just kill, it erases. Slowly the mind shuts down, hallucinations blur reality, and the victim dies in a kind of waking dream. Vikings knew this. Exposure wasn't simply a method of execution. It was a warning that nature itself sided with those who punished you. Sometimes the punishment was harsher. Prisoners might be doused with water before being tied in winter, the freezing air turning their skin into glass. Flesh cracked, blood vessels burst, and death came slow, painful, and undeniable. And yet, Vikings weren't always satisfied with letting nature do the work. Some punishments were intentionally staged to amplify humiliation. One saga describes how offenders were bound and dragged behind ships over rocky shores. The scraping tore skin and muscle until only bone remained. It wasn't efficient, but efficiency wasn't the point. Spectacle was. To see a human being mangled in this way sent a clear message: step out of line, and your body will tell the story. Other times, bodies were broken with precision, a method known in later accounts as the spread eagle left victims pinned, their joints shattered one by one. The torture wasn't in the speed of killing, but in the deliberate pause between each break. Each scream was part of the theater. If all this sounds barbaric, it's important to remember the Vikings weren't unique in using torture. Medieval Europe, the Middle East, and Asia all had their own nightmarish practices. But what made Viking methods stand out was how they wove suffering into their cultural fabric, not just punishment, but ritual. Take a sacrifice. Archaeological finds at bog sites in Denmark and Sweden show human remains bound, stabbed, and deposited in water. These weren't battlefield deaths. They were offerings. In Viking cosmology, the gods demanded blood, and sometimes the chosen were prisoners of war, sometimes criminals, and sometimes unlucky slaves. To be sacrificed wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about power, the living demonstrating control over life and death, while ensuring the gods were fed. And then there's the horror of being used as entertainment. Accounts tell of Viking feasts where captives were mutilated for sport, fingers hacked off and tossed into the fire, eyes gouged to amuse drunk warriors. In some cases, victims were forced to sing while being tortured. The louder and longer they lasted, the more honor they paradoxically earned. The sagas even preserve songs composed in these moments, grim echoes of resilience. But endurance didn't always mean freedom. Even if you impressed your captors, death was almost always the endgame. One of the cruelest aspects of Viking torture wasn't the methods themselves, but the way death was delayed. Quick killing was too merciful. Punishments could stretch for days. The victim was kept alive just enough to suffer more. Wounds were cauterized not to heal, but to prolong. Captives were fed just enough food and water to stay conscious. The goal wasn't simply to kill, but to stretch mortality like a bowstring, to see how far a human could bend before breaking. And if you think that's extreme, it gets worse. Consider the Viking obsession with honor. For them, how you died mattered as much as how you lived, which meant that torture wasn't just about making you suffer, it was about shaping the narrative of your end. To die screaming, begging, humiliated, that was eternal shame. To die silently, defiantly, that was remembered. Some sagas glorify men who endured torture without a sound, painting them as heroes even in defeat, which meant the tortures weren't just executioners, they were playwrights in a performance where the victim decided if the story ended in shame or glory. But the Vikings didn't just torture people, they tortured memory. Bodies were left unburied, denied funeral rites, denied entry to Valhalla. This was spiritual torture. In Norse belief, the afterlife was everything. To strip someone of burial, to leave them rotting in a field, was to erase them from eternity. That punishment was so feared that many considered it worse than physical agony. Imagine suffering in life and knowing you'd be erased in death. And sometimes they went further. Corpses were mutilated, heads removed, genitals cut off, bones scattered, so the soul could never rest. Archaeologists have uncovered Viking graves where skeletons were deliberately dismembered, likely as part of this ritual destruction. Torture didn't end with the last breath. It followed into the grave. Now here's a question. Did the Vikings invent these nightmares, or were they adapting from others? Because the sagas reveal something interesting. Many tortures appear in contexts of cultural contact. The blood eagle, for example, shows up in stories about English and Irish kings. The honey smearing and insect torture have parallels in Persian accounts. This suggests Vikings may have absorbed, adapted, and spread methods across borders, blending brutality into their own mythos. They weren't just warriors, they were collectors of fear. And yet the darkest Viking torture wasn't always about tools or fire or knives. It was about hopelessness. Imagine being enslaved, captured in a raid, dragged from your homeland, sold in a foreign port, The Norse slave system, thralls, didn't just strip freedom, it left people in perpetual vulnerability. A thrall could be whipped, branded, or mutilated at will. Some were forced to wear iron collars engraved with their master's name. For them, daily life itself became a slow torture. And though sagas don't always dwell on this cruelty, archaeology reminds us, shackles, iron chains, and skeletal remains bearing marks of abuse. It's a reminder that Viking torture wasn't limited to rare, spectacular executions. Sometimes it was woven into the quiet grind of existence. And still, we haven't reached the deepest shadows, because there are whispers of punishment so grotesque, so deliberately inhuman, that even Viking sources treat them with horror. One example, the snake pit, Ragnar Lothbrok's legendary death, thrown into a pit filled with venomous serpents, left to be bitten repeatedly until the poison finally silenced him. Was it literal? Maybe, maybe not. But the symbolism mattered. To die in a pit of snakes wasn't just agony. It was humiliation, being reduced to prey in a world where Vikings prided themselves as predators. But whether the snakes were real or metaphor, the image burned itself into legend, a final testament to torture as theater, as storytelling, as eternal warning. But the snake pit was only one piece of a broader reality. Viking torture was about making the victim's end unforgettable, and some methods were so extreme that they seem almost designed to echo forever in the minds of those who witnessed them. Take slow cutting. In certain accounts, prisoners were methodically sliced, bit by bit, without ever receiving a killing blow. A nose was removed here, an ear there, fingers taken one after another. Each wound was small enough to keep the victim alive, but deliberate enough to keep the audience on edge. Hours stretched into days. By the time death finally came, the body was hardly recognizable. But the lesson was crystal clear: betray us, and every part of you will pay the price. Sometimes torture wasn't even about how you died, but how you looked when you were gone. Archaeological finds showed decapitated skulls mounted on spikes, or jawbones nailed to doors as trophies. The sagas describe heads paraded around villages, smeared with tar to slow decay. It wasn't only intimidation, it was about ownership. By defacing your corpse, Vikings claimed your memory as their property, rewriting your story with your mutilated remains. And yet even here, a strange paradox existed. Because in Viking belief, death in battle could be glorious. But torture blurred the line. If you died screaming, you were shamed. If you endured in silence, you might still achieve a form of honor. In this way, torture wasn't simply cruelty, it was a test. But what about torture as law? The Vikings had a complex legal system. The Thing, assemblies where disputes were resolved. Not every case ended in blood, but when it did, punishments could be designed to embody the crime itself. A thief might have his hands crushed or cut off. A slanderer might have his tongue removed. The punishment wasn't random, it was symbolic. You abused your hands, you lose them. You abused your words, you lose your speech. These acts turned justice into a kind of living metaphor. Brutal, yes, but unmistakable in its meaning. Still, the darkest Viking tortures often blurred justice with vengeance. Family feuds could spiral into endless cycles of humiliation and pain. To kill someone outright was closure. To torture them was an escalation. And sagas are full of episodes where vengeance required creativity. One example describes a man being carved open and his intestines pulled out, then nailed to a tree while he was forced to walk around it until he collapsed. A grotesque punishment, yes, but one designed to satisfy the idea that vengeance had to be seen, not just done. And then there's the role of public ritual. Torture was rarely hidden. It was performed before crowds, sometimes before entire villages. Why? Because watching mattered as much as inflicting. In a world where oral storytelling carried memory, witnessing a gruesome death guaranteed it would be retold. Each scream, each wound, each humiliation became part of a living archive. The victim's suffering turned into legend, reinforcing the power of those who ordered it. But here's the most unsettling part. Not all Viking torture was about outsiders. Sometimes it was turned inward, against their own kin. Slaves bore the brunt of this. The sagas rarely dwell on their pain, but archaeology does. Chains, iron collars, bones scarred from repeated beatings. Thralls could be executed for attempting escape, sometimes with methods deliberately slow to discourage others. Their deaths weren't just punishment, they were examples. Ensuring fear kept the system intact. Even free Vikings weren't safe. Betrayal, cowardice, or breaking sacred oaths could invite punishments as gruesome as anything inflicted on enemies. To the Norse mind, law and honor had sharp teeth, and torture was their bite. And yet, despite all this, some tortures seem almost designed to mock human dignity itself. One method involved tying victims upside down, heads plunged into latrines or cesspits until suffocation ended them. The symbolism was clear: die in filth, remembered with disgust. Another, described in later sources, mentions prisoners locked in wooden frames and left for dogs to gnaw alive. These weren't just executions, they were degradations, erasing humanity along with life. But if we zoom out, a pattern emerges. Viking tortures weren't random acts of cruelty. They followed themes: humiliation, spectacle, symbolism, and endurance. Each method reinforced power structures, cultural values, or spiritual beliefs. Each one told a story, even if that story was carved in flesh. And yet, the blood eagle still looms above them all, because even now, centuries later, it dominates the imagination. Why? Maybe because it captures everything about Viking torture in one image. The body opened, the lungs spread, a human being turned into a symbol, whether it was real or ritual, myth or memory. The blood eagle shows how the Norse saw suffering as theater, as justice, as legacy. But here's the question to sit with: if you lived in that world, would you choose to fight, knowing capture meant this? Or would you, like many did, pray for death on the battlefield, sword in hand, chest to the enemy, because anything was better than falling alive into Viking hands? For the Vikings, torture wasn't only about punishment, it was also about control. A society built on raiding, honor, and reputation needed fear as much as it needed steel. And torture gave fear a body. Picture a longhouse filled with silence, every villager watching as a condemned man was dragged inside. They all knew what was coming. Maybe his crime was betrayal, maybe cowardice in battle, maybe nothing more than being on the wrong side of a feud. What mattered wasn't just that he would die, it was that his death would remind everyone else what happened when the rules of honor were broken. The Norse didn't write their laws on stone tablets or hide punishments behind castle walls. They carved justice into human beings, then made sure entire communities remembered every detail. But here's the paradox: the Vikings also valued resilience. They admired those who could withstand agony without flinching. Stories survive of warriors captured and tortured, who never cried out, never begged. Their captors may have killed them anyway, but their silence transformed the humiliation into legend. It's this strange duality, torture as both shame and honor, that makes Viking justice feel so alien to us today. And then there's the legacy of fear. Long after the Viking Age ended, stories of their tortures continued to circulate across Europe. Monks wrote about raids not just in terms of burning churches and looted treasures, but in whispered descriptions of what happened to those unlucky enough to be taken alive. The horror became part of the Viking brand. It spread faster than their ships. That branding mattered. Imagine hearing that Vikings might come not only to raid your home, but to drag you back and subject you to unimaginable torment. That fear alone was enough to make towns surrender, rulers pay tribute, and enemies hesitate. Torture wasn't just punishment, it was psychological warfare, and the shadow of it still lingers today. The blood eagle is debated endlessly by historians, because even now, centuries later, we can't decide what's worse: that it might have been invented as propaganda, or that it might have really happened. If it was propaganda, then Viking storytellers understood something powerful. The idea of torture can be as terrifying as the act itself. If it was real, then we're left with the image of human beings turned into gruesome displays of power, lungs spread wide while entire communities watched. Either way, the effect was the same, fear that outlived the victims. But perhaps the most chilling part is this: Viking torture wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't the act of madmen or monsters. It was structured, intentional, and embedded in their culture. It was a tool used by leaders, families, and communities to reinforce laws, beliefs, and dominance, which means the true horror isn't just in the methods, but in how normalized they were. So when we talk about Viking torture today, what do we really see? Not just the brutality of the past, but a mirror of how far humans will go to control one another through fear. Because behind every rib cracked open, every body smeared with honey, every throat silenced by drowning, there's a question that still echoes: how much pain would it take to keep you silent? And if you were there, standing in the crowd, watching it unfold, would you look away, or would you stare, knowing that remembering was part of the point? That silence, that stare, that memory, that's where Viking torture still lives. Not in sagas alone, not in the soil of old battlefields, but in the way their methods still force us to confront the darkest part of human nature, the need to make suffering into spectacle. So when you hear the word Viking, don't just picture axes, longships, and roaring warriors on distant shores. Picture the long, slow suffering of those who fell into their hands. Picture the cold precision of punishments, designed not only to kill, but to strip humanity away piece by piece. Picture a culture where death was never the worst fate, because the worst fate was living long enough to beg for death.